The iron-gray sky of the English coast seemed to press down on the world, heavy with the scent of upcoming rain and the salt of the restless Atlantic. Benedict Sterling, the Earl of Ravenhurst, stood on the limestone quay with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He was a man defined by edges, the sharp line of his jaw, the impeccable crease of his black trousers, and the cold, unyielding precision of his mind. At 35, Benedict had long ago decided that life was a series of obligations to be met and debts to be paid. His heart was a locked room, the key lost years ago in the wreckage of a family legacy he had been forced to rebuild from nothing. He didn't want a wife to love. He wanted a countess who could balance a ledger and maintain the dignity of his name. The ship, the Golden Star, emerged from the mist like a ghost. It carried the answer to Benedict's financial prayers, Aurora Thorne. She was the daughter of a titan of industry from the Americas, a man who had built an empire of steel but lacked the one thing Benedict possessed in excess: pedigree. The marriage contract was a masterpiece of cold logic. Benedict would receive a dowry large enough to restore the crumbling east wing of Ravenhurst Hall and settle the debts his father had accrued at the gambling tables. In return, Aurora would receive the social standing that only an earldom could provide in the rigid hierarchy of London society. It was a trade, pure and simple. As the gangplank was lowered, Benedict adjusted his cuffs. He expected a girl who was overwhelmed, perhaps a bit frightened by the gray, imposing reality of England. He expected a woman he could mold, someone who would sit quietly at the dinner table and speak only when spoken to. But as Aurora Thorne stepped onto the dock, the air around Benedict seemed to crackle. She didn't walk. She moved with a rhythmic, pulsing energy that made the gloomy morning seem suddenly drab. Her hair was a vibrant, untamed gold, catching the meager light, and her eyes were a piercing, intelligent blue, the color of the deep ocean just before a storm. She didn't wait for him to greet her. Aurora stepped off the wood and onto the stone, looking up at the towering man before her with a gaze that was disturbingly observant. She didn't curtsy. She didn't lower her head. Instead, she offered a hand that was gloved in fine kidskin, but felt remarkably firm when he took it. "You must be Benedict," she said, her voice lacking the hesitant tremor he had anticipated. It was a voice like dark honey, sweet, but with a thickness that suggested depth. "You look exactly as I imagined, very tall, very stern, and very much in need of a reason to smile." Benedict stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "And you, Miss Thorne, are far more forward than your father's letter suggested. Welcome to Ravenhurst. We have a long journey ahead of us, and I have much to explain regarding the expectations of your new position." "My position?" Aurora laughed, a short, musical sound that echoed off the damp stone. "You make it sound like I've been hired as your new estate manager, my lord. I assure you, I didn't cross an ocean just to be an employee in a fancy dress." The carriage ride to Ravenhurst Hall was a battle of silence versus sound. Benedict sat perfectly still, a statue of aristocratic reserve, while Aurora seemed to take up every inch of the remaining space. She didn't stare in awe at the ancient oaks or the rolling green hills. Instead, she watched him, her head tilted, as if she were solving a complex puzzle. Benedict found himself increasingly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. He was used to being the observer, the one who judged and measured. Having the tables turned felt like a violation of his carefully constructed order. "We shall live separate lives for the most part," Benedict said, breaking the silence as the carriage turned onto the long, gravel drive of the estate. "Ravenhurst is a massive house. You will have your own rooms, your own servants, and a budget that will allow you any luxury you desire. In exchange, I expect you to preside over our social engagements with grace, and to never cause a scandal that would tarnish the Sterling name. It is a marriage of convenience, Aurora. Nothing more, nothing less." Aurora leaned forward, her blue eyes locking onto his. And what if I find convenience to be terribly boring, Benedict? What if I want more than just a room in a house that smells of old paper and tradition? Then you should have married a poet, not an earl, he replied coldly. As they arrived at the hall, the sheer scale of the building seemed to rise up to meet them. It was a fortress of gray stone and ivy, beautiful but desolate. For Benedict, it was a burden he carried on his shoulders every day. For Aurora, as she looked up at the darkened windows and the silent gargoyles, it looked like a challenge. In the weeks that followed, the collision of their worlds became unavoidable. Benedict tried to ignore her, retreating into his study to manage the accounts and the harvest reports. But Aurora was like the wind. She found every crack in the door. He would hear her singing in the hallways, a sound that felt dangerously out of place in a silent house. He would find her in the library, not reading the delicate poetry he thought she would like, but studying maps of the state and books on modern agriculture. The first real spark of conflict came when Benedict discovered her in the stables, helping a groom birth a foal in the middle of the night. He had been alerted by a frantic servant and arrived to find his countess covered in straw and blood, her expensive silk sleeves pushed up to her elbows, her face glowing with a fierce, primal joy as the small creature took its first breath. "This is unseemly," Benedict had roared, his pride wounded by the sight of her in such a state. "You are the Countess of Ravenhurst, not a stable hand. Think of what the staff will say." Aurora had stood up, wiping her hands on a cloth, her eyes blazing with fire that made Benedict take a half-step back. "Let them say I am alive, Benedict. Let them say their mistress isn't a porcelain doll waiting to break, while you were in your study counting your gold. This life was struggling to begin. I will not apologize for being part of the world while you hide from it." They stood there in the dim light of the stable, the air thick with the scent of hay and the heat of their shared anger. Benedict felt a surge of something he couldn't name, a mixture of fury and a sudden, terrifying attraction. He looked at the smudge of dirt on her nose and the way her hair was matted with sweat. And for the first time in a decade, he felt his heart beat with something other than duty. It was a moment of pure, raw connection, and it scared him more than any debt or scandal ever could. He turned on his heel and walked away, but he could still feel her eyes on his back, challenging him to come back to life. The morning after the incident in the stables, Ravenhurst Hall felt different. The silence that Benedict had curated for years like a priceless collection of porcelain was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, vibrating with the echoes of Aurora's laughter and her sharp, unapologetic words. Benedict sat in his study, the sunlight slanting to the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing over his ledgers. For the first time in his life, the numbers wouldn't align. He kept seeing the image of his countess, dirty, exhausted, and radiantly alive, holding that shivering foal. It was a vision of raw humanity that made his neatly ordered world feel suddenly shallow and brittle. Benedict tried to reestablish the distance. He stayed in his wing of the house, avoiding the communal rooms, convincing himself that if he didn't see her, he could forget the way his heart had hammered against his ribs in the hayloft. But Aurora Thorne was not a woman who could be avoided. She began a subtle but relentless campaign to dismantle the gloom of the estate. She ordered the heavy velvet curtains in the drawing room to be taken down and replaced with light, airy linens that let the sun pour in. She brought in bowls of wildflowers and dried herbs, replacing the scent of wax and old leather with the fragrance of a world in bloom. The true test of their arrangement came during the preparations for the harvest gala. Traditionally, it was a stiff, formal affair where the local gentry came to pay their respects to the Earl and eat a silent, overcooked dinner. Benedict expected Aurora to follow the old protocols. Instead, he found her in the ballroom, instructing the servants to move the tables to the perimeter and hiring a group of local fiddlers instead of the usual string quartet from London. "What is the meaning of this, Aurora?" Benedict asked, standing in the doorway with his arms folded across his chest. This gala has been the same for 3 generations. It is a moment of dignity for the family, not a village fair. Aurora didn't stop her work. She climbed down from a small ladder, her face flushed with exertion. And for 3 generations, Benedict, your guests have looked like they were attending a funeral. Why must dignity be so miserable? These people work your land. They support your name. They deserve a night where they can actually feel the joy of the harvest, not just the weight of your history. It is not about joy, Benedict snapped, his voice echoing in the large room. It is about respect. It is about maintaining the boundary between the Earl of Ravenhurst and the world. The boundary is a wall you built to keep yourself from feeling anything, she replied, stepping close to him. She smelled of sunshine and lavender, a combination that made Benedict's head swim. You're so afraid that if you let your guard down for one night, the whole world will see that you're just a man. Well, news for you, Benedict, they already know. They're just waiting for you to realize it too. The night of the gala was a revelation. Benedict spent the first hour in a state of high anxiety, waiting for the scandal to break. But as the music started, a lively, rhythmic tune that made the floorboard hum, he saw something he hadn't expected. The local barons and their wives were laughing. The tenants were dancing. The cold, stagnant air of Ravenhurst had been replaced by a pulsing, vibrant energy. And at the center of it all was Aurora. She moved through the crowd with a natural grace, speaking to everyone from the highest lord to the youngest stable boy, making them feel as if they were the only person in the room. Benedict watched her from the shadows of the balcony, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. He watched the way her dress caught the candlelight, the way her hair seemed to glow, and the way her eyes sought him out in the darkness. When she finally found him, she didn't say a word. She simply walked up the stairs, held out her hand, and waited. "I don't dance," Benedict said, his voice a low growl of defense. "You don't live, Benedict," she whispered. "Today, just for one song, try." Against every instinct of self-preservation he possessed, Benedict took her hand. As they moved onto the floor, the room went silent for a heartbeat. The Earl was dancing. It wasn't the stiff, mechanical movement of a man performing a duty. As the music took hold, Benedict felt the walls he had built around his soul beginning to crumble. He held her waist, feeling the warmth of her body through the silk of her gown, and for a moment, the debts, the crumbling estate, and the cold expectations of his title vanished. There was only the rhythm, the light, and the woman who had turned his world upside down. But the moment of peace was short-lived. In the corner of the room, Lord Julian Vane, a rival with a long-standing grudge against the Sterling family, was watching them with a predatory smile. He knew the truth about the Thorne dowry, and he knew that Benedict's marriage at convenience was a desperate gamble to save a bankrupt legacy. As the song ended, Vane approached them, his voice dripping with false concern. "A lovely party, Ravenhurst," Vane said, his eyes lingering on Aurora with an insulting familiarity. "I suppose one must celebrate while there is still a roof over one's head. I heard a rumor that the creditors are becoming impatient. I wonder, does the new countess know exactly why she was purchased?" Benedict felt the blood drain from his face. He felt Aurora's hand tighten in his, her blue eyes darting between him and Vane. The secret he had been protecting, the fact that their marriage was the only thing standing between him and the loss of Ravenhurst, was now out in the open. He looked at Aurora, expecting to see betrayal or anger. Instead, he saw a sharp, cold intelligence. "Purchased," Aurora said, her voice cutting through Vane's smugness like a blade. "Lord Vane, you speak as if men like Benedict can be bought. In my country, we don't buy people, we invest in them. And I assure you, my investment in Ravenhurst and its Earl is the most profitable decision I have ever made. Now, if you'll excuse us, the music is far too good to waste on gossip." She led Benedict away before Vane could respond, but as soon as they were out of earshot, she dropped his hand. They stood in the quiet of the hallway. The distant music, a mocking reminder of the joy they had just shared. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "Are we bankrupt?" Benedict couldn't look at her. The shame he had carried for years felt like an iron weight in his chest. "I did what I had to do to save my family's name. Aurora, I never intended for you to be part of the scandal." "I don't care about the scandal, Benedict," she cried, her eyes filling with tears of frustration. "I care that you didn't trust me. You married me for my money, and you kept me in the dark as if I were a child. Was any of it real? The dancing, the look in your eyes? Or was that just part of the transaction?" Benedict reached for her, but she stepped back, the light in her eyes replaced by a cold, distant pain. He had expected a marriage of convenience, but he had found a woman who demanded a soul. And now, by trying to protect his pride, he was on the verge of losing the only thing that had ever made him feel alive. The silence that followed Lord Vane's departure was more deafening than the loudest thunderclap. Benedict stood in the dimly lit corridor, his breath hitching in his chest, watching the retreating figure of the woman who had, in just a few short months, become the center of his gravity. Aurora's back was straight, her steps purposeful, but he could see the slight tremble in her shoulders. The shame he had suppressed for years, the crushing weight of being the Earl who lost it all, now felt like a physical poison in his veins. He had spent his life protecting the Sterling name, only to realize that in doing so, he had treated the only person who mattered like a line item in a ledger. He found her in the conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. She was standing by a row of ferns, her hands clenched at her sides, staring out into the moonlit gardens. The vibrant, gold-threaded gown she had worn for the gala now looked like a costume from a play that had ended in tragedy. Benedict stopped at the threshold. The words he needed to say stuck in his throat. How could a man who had lived by cold logic explain that he had fallen in love with his own business arrangement? "I never wanted you to find out that way," Benedict said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Aurora turned, and the moonlight caught the tears shimmering on her cheeks. "Find out what, Benedict? That you were desperate? I knew you needed the money. My father isn't a fool, and neither am I. We knew Ravenhurst was struggling. But I thought you chose me. I thought that despite the contract, you saw something in me that you wanted. But to hear it spoken like that I was purchased to keep your roof from falling in, it makes everything we've shared feel like a lie." "It wasn't a lie," Benedict said, taking a step toward her, his hand reaching out instinctively before he pulled it back. "The accounts, the debts, those were the reasons for beginning. But they are not the reason I want you to stay. Aurora, I was a dead man before you arrived. I was a ghost haunting a stone tomb. You brought the sun back to this house. You brought it back to me. Then why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice rising with a mix of hurt and anger. "Why did you let me walk into rooms full of people who knew more about your life than I did? You treated me like a decorative shield, Benedict. You used my dowry to fix your walls, but you kept the walls around your heart exactly where they were." The confrontation was raw, stripping away the layers of aristocratic decorum that Benedict had used as armor. He realized then that his greatest sin wasn't the debt. It was his lack of faith. He hadn't trusted her enough to be his partner. He had wanted a marriage of convenience, because convenience didn't require vulnerability. But passion, real and unbridled, had turned his world upside down, leaving him exposed. In the days that followed, a Cold War politeness settled over Ravenhurst Hall. They shared meals in a silence that felt heavy and jagged. Aurora didn't leave, but she withdrew into herself, her laughter silenced, her presence in the house now as ghostly as Benedict's had once been. Benedict found he couldn't return to his old life. The ledgers were meaningless. The estate reports were hollow. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the look of betrayal in her blue eyes, driven by a desperation he had never known. Benedict began to act. He didn't go to his lawyers or his bankers. He went to the people. He spent his days in the village, talking to the tenants Aurora had championed. He looked at the repairs that were still needed through her eyes, not as costs, but as investments in lives. He sold off pieces of the family's private collection, statues and paintings that had sat in the dark for a century, to fund a new schoolhouse and a clinic. He was dismantling the Sterling pride piece by piece, trying to build something that Aurora would recognize as worthy. But the shadow of Lord Vane still loomed. Vane wasn't content with just revealing the debt. He wanted the land. He began buying up the surrounding notes, positioning himself to force a foreclosure on the Ravenhurst woods. It was a calculated move to destroy Benedict completely. When the legal notice arrived, Benedict didn't hide it. He walked into the morning room where Aurora was sitting by the window and placed a document on the table between them. "Vane is coming to the estate," Benedict said simply. "He has found a loophole in the old mortgage. Within 30 days, he could own the heart of this valley." Aurora looked at the paper, then up at him. For the first time in weeks, the distance in her eyes flickered. "And what are you going to do?" "I am going to fight," Benedict said, his jaw set with a new kind of resolve. "But I cannot do it as the Earl of Ravenhurst. I have to do it as a man who has nothing left to lose except his wife's respect. I don't care about the title anymore. Aurora, I care about this home. Our home. If you want to leave, I have secured enough of your dowry in a separate trust that you will be wealthy for the rest of your life. You can go back to the Americas. You could be free of this gray sky and my mistakes." Aurora stood up, walking slowly toward him. She looked at the man who had once been so rigid, so terrified of a smudge of dirt or a loud voice. He looked tired, his coat was dusty, and his eyes were full of a terrifying, honest hope. "You really think I'm that fragile, don't you?" she asked, a small, familiar spark returning to her voice. "You think I'd run away just because the weather turned sour? Benedict, I didn't marry a title. I married a man who was too stubborn to admit he was lonely. If we're going to fight Vane, we're going to do it my way. No more polite letters. No more hiding. We're going to show them that a Sterling and a Thorne together are more dangerous than any debt." She reached out and took his hand, her grip as firm as the day they had met on the docks. In that moment, the convenience of their marriage died, and something much more powerful, a true partnership, was born. But as they looked out at the darkening horizon, they both knew that Vane was only the first of many storms they would have to face. The days that followed were no longer marked by the cold, ticking clock of Benedict's old life, but by a feverish, shared energy that transformed Ravenhurst Hall into a war room. Aurora, with the sharp business instincts of her father in the fire of the New World, didn't just sit by the window. She took over the small library, spreading maps and legal documents across the floor. Benedict found himself not leading her, but standing beside her. He saw a woman who could navigate a legal loophole as easily as she could ride a horse across the moors. For a man who had always equated control with solitude, this partnership was a revelation, and a terrifyingly beautiful one. "Vane isn't just trying to take the land, Benedict," Aurora said one evening, the candlelight throwing long shadows across her determined face. "He's trying to humiliate you. He wants to prove that the old blood of England is weak. But he's forgotten one thing. You're not just an earl anymore. You're a man with a wife who knows how to fight for what belongs to her." Benedict looked at her, and the passion he had been trying to suppress flared up, hotter and more undeniable than ever. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I don't deserve you, Aurora. I brought you here as a solution to a problem, and you become the only thing I've ever truly wanted." "Then stop fighting me, Benedict," she whispered, her blue eyes dark with a matching intensity, "and start fighting with me." The physical distance between them, which had been a wall of glass, finally shattered. It wasn't a moment of convenience or duty. when Benedict pulled her into his arms. It was with the desperation of a man who had finally found home after decades in the cold. Their kiss was a vow, a silent promise that whatever Vane or the London creditors threw at them, they would stand or fall together. In the quiet of the night, the Earl of Ravenhurst finally let go of his pride, and in its place, he found a strength he had never known, the strength of being loved for exactly who he was, without the title or the gold. However, Lord Vane was a serpent who thrived in the tall grass. He arrived at Ravenhurst 3 days before foreclosure deadline, not with a lawyer, but with a smug smile and a piece of paper that made Benedict's blood run cold. Vane had found a debt from Benedict's father that had been hidden in a secondary ledger, a debt that included a clause giving Vane the right to the very house they stood in, not just land. "It's over, Ravenhurst," Vane sneered, standing in the grand foyer, his boots tracking mud onto the polished stone. "The Sterling legacy ends with you. You're a pauper in a fancy coat. I'll give you until sunset to pack your bags. I might even let you keep the American girl's jewelry if you beg nicely." Benedict felt the old fury rising, the urge to strike the man down. But before he could speak, Aurora stepped forward. She didn't look like a woman who was losing her home. She looked like a predator. "You've been very busy, Lord Vane," she said, her voice smooth and dangerous. "But while you were digging through the past, I was looking at your present. My father's company handles the shipping for half the iron in the colonies. It turns out your family's investment firms have been skimming profits from the American trade for years. I have the receipts, the names, and the letters. If you take this house, I will release those documents to the Crown. You won't just be poor, Vane. You'll be in a cell in the Tower for treason against the trade laws." The color drained from Vane's face. The paper in his hand began to shake. He looked at Benedict, then at the golden-haired woman who stood like a shield in front of her husband. He had expected a marriage of convenience, a weak man and a bought girl. He hadn't expected a Thorne and a Sterling who would forge their hearts into a single blade. "You're bluffing," Vane hissed. "Try me," Aurora replied, her eyes cold as a winter sea. "You have 10 minutes to leave this estate. If I see your carriage on my drive after that, I send the first letter to London. And Benedict, he's much more patient than I am. He might let you keep your coat, but I won't." Vane didn't wait. He turned and fled, the sound of his carriage wheels on the gravel sounding like a victory march. Benedict stood in the sudden silence of the hall, looking at his wife. He felt a strange sensation, a lightness in his chest, as if the weight of the entire world had been lifted. He started to laugh, a deep, genuine sound that filled the ancient house. "You are a terrifying woman, Aurora Sterling," he said, pulling her into his arms and spinning her around. "And you are a man who needs to learn that sometimes the best way to keep your world from turning upside down is to let someone else help you hold it up." She laughed, her arms around his neck. But as they stood in their home, finally safe, Benedict realized that the real challenge was just beginning. They had saved the house, but they still had to build a life. The convenience was gone, replaced by a passion that was as unpredictable as a storm. And as the sun set over Ravenhurst, painting the gray stone in shades of gold and violet, Benedict knew that he would never be the same man again. He had expected a partner for his ledgers, but he had found the keeper of his soul. The winter frost had begun to melt, giving way to the first fragile blooms of an English spring, and with the changing season, Ravenhurst Hall had completed its own transformation. It was no longer a fortress of shadows and silence. The windows were perpetually open, the air filled with the scent of beeswax, lavender, and the distant, rhythmic sound of construction from the new cottages Benedict was building for the tenants. The estate was breathing again, and at its heart, the Earl and Countess lived not as two strangers bound by a contract, but as a single force of nature. Benedict stood in the same study where he had once counted every penny in fear. Now, The ledgers were full of growth, not debt. But the true change was in the man himself. He no longer wore his coat like a suit of armor. His collar was often open, his hair occasionally windswept from long rides across the moors with Aurora. He had learned that a leader's strength wasn't measured by the height of his walls, but by the depth of his connection to those within them. He was a man who had been saved by the very inconvenience he had once feared. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a spectacular display of violet and gold, Benedict found Aurora in the nursery wing. They had been working together to restore this part of the house, not just for the sake of the building, but for the future they were now building together. Aurora was standing by a window, her silhouette framed by the fading light. She looked peaceful, a stark contrast to the fierce warrior who had faced down Lord Vane. "I was thinking about the dogs," Benedict said softly, walking up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. About the man who stood there in the fog, waiting for a business transaction. He had no idea that his life was about to end, and a real one was about to begin. Aurora leaned back against his chest, sighing contentedly. He was a very grumpy man, Benedict. I remember thinking he looked like he had swallowed a bag of gravel. Benedict laughed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I was terrified of you. From the moment you stepped off that ship, you were a storm I couldn't track. I expected a marriage where I would be the master of everything. Instead, I found a partner who showed me I was a master of nothing, not even my own heart." "And are you sorry?" she asked, turning his arms to look up at him with those bright, intelligent blue eyes. "Do you miss the order? The silence? The convenience of not having someone to argue with about the price of wool?" "I would trade 1,000 years of silence for 1 minute of your voice," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save my estate, Aurora. You saved my soul. I used to think that love was a liability, a weakness that men like me couldn't afford. But now I see that it's the only thing that makes the burden of the title worth carrying. The passion that had once turned his world upside down had now become the foundation of his world. They had faced the creditors, the scandals, and the shadows of the past, and they had emerged not just intact, but reborn. As the first stars began to twinkle over the Ravenhurst woods, Benedict realized that the most convenient thing about their marriage was how perfectly they fit together. The story of the Earl of Ravenhurst and his American countess became a legend in the countryside, a story of how old blood and new spirit forged a legacy that would last for generations. They proved that a marriage of convenience could indeed be a transaction, but when handled with courage and honesty, it could become a transaction of the heart. Benedict Sterling had expected a countess to sit at his table, but he had found a queen to rule his life. And as they walked to the halls of their home, hand in hand, the silence was finally gone, replaced by the beautiful, chaotic, and vibrant sound of a life truly lived. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us bring you more tales of love, betrayal, and destiny. And if your heart still craves more, explore the other stories waiting for you here. You might just find your next obsession.